Hello my friends, in today's video we will take a look at Fujifilm X-H2S. This is in my opinion a very important camera because it is the first flagship APS-C camera to be announced since 2017 and basically the first hybrid flagship APS-C camera ever. It is also a very important camera for Fujifilm because it introduces a lot of new technology, including the new stacked X-Trans5HS sensor. In this video, we will take a look at the performance and the feature set of X-H2S, and I will try to help you decide whether you should consider getting one. Fujifilm basically makes two types of cameras, experience-oriented and pragmatic. This is a purely pragmatic camera with conventional controls. Considering the specifications, it is much smaller than I anticipated. It is about 13.5 centimeters wide and it weighs 660 grams, including a battery and memory card. The build quality is very similar to the X-T4, which means that it is very good. It uses magnesium frame and most of the surface is rubberized with a very nice texture. The only weakness in terms of the build quality is also shared with the X-T4, and that is the rotating screen mechanism. Despite that, I can say that it feels like a premium product. It also has a lot of that vintage look and I think that it looks really good. The X-H2S uses a brand new X-Trans5HS 26.1 megapixel backside illuminated, stacked or layered CMOS sensor. It is paired with a brand new X-Processor 5 with twice as much performance in comparison to X-Processor 4. That means that this camera is very fast, we will get to that in a minute. 26.1 megapixels is in my opinion still sufficient for the majority of use cases, especially in a camera which is meant to be fast in the first place. It also allows the camera to have pretty incredible video specs, we will get to that later as well. The low light performance of the X-Trans5HS is pretty much identical to the X-Trans4. The noise at ISO 3200 is acceptable for the majority of publishing platforms. ISO 6400 is also suitable in most cases, but the noise is clearly visible. ISO 12800 is an emergency option. There is a lot of noise, but it will still get the colors right. Keep in mind that Fujifilm uses a different ISO scale than Sony, for example, so if you want to compare the ISO performance to Sony, you need to use ISO values higher by about 2/3 of a stop. This is still the best ISO performance that you can get with an APS-C sensor, but if you are expecting an improvement over the X-Trans4, that is not the case. The same applies to the dynamic range. That is actually very impressive even by 2022 standards. As long as you keep the ISO down, you will be able to use shadows and highlight sliders without noise restrictions. The RAW files capture a very solid amount of information, so I am generally very happy with the dynamic range and it is still the best that you can get with an APS-C sensor. The colors also seem to be identical to the X-Trans4 cameras, which is definitely not a bad thing. X-Trans4 cameras are among the most color accurate on the market, so the X-Trans5 continues with this trend. The colors are generally very neutral and quite easy to work with in post-production. X-H2S naturally offers all of the film simulations that have been introduced so far. My favorites are still the classic chrome and classic negative, although I actually like all of them, so the film simulations are definitely a nice benefit of Fujifilm cameras. One of the main highlights of this camera is definitely the shooting speed. Thanks to that stacked sensor, Fujifilm X-H2S can shoot up to 40 frames per second with autofocus continuous, in 14-bit RAW with automatic exposure using the electronic shutter. Because it is a stacked sensor with very fast readout, the electronic shutter won't introduce any rolling shutter issues. I actually don't use mechanical shutter with this camera at all. 40 frames per second is obviously an incredible speed, sufficient basically for any kind of fast action shooting. Importantly, the buffer can match that shooting speed. At 40 frames per second you will get 170 lossless compressed RAWs. If you go down to 20 frames per second you will get basically unlimited buffer. That applies if you use a CF Express card. X-H2S uses Type B cards, which is a good choice due to the speed and availability. The other slot is just UHS-2 SD, so if you want the full write speed you will lose the backup option. It does behave like a proper flagship camera though. You can enter the playback menu and change all of the settings immediately after you have shot hundreds of RAWs. The X-H2S uses a new autofocus system. Fujifilm claims 2.16 million face detection pixels with 425 selectable points. The focusing should benefit a lot from the increased processing power. It has handled all of my usual tests with no issues at all. It is extremely fast, 100% accurate, and there is no hunting whatsoever. The question is really the tracking, which fortunately works great. It was also able to handle everything that I threw at it. I got a perfect hit rate with a subject walking or even running towards the camera, which is probably the most difficult task. I can say that the autofocus matches the continuous shooting speed of this camera. This autofocus system also employs a number of smart features which are meant to identify the subject and track it. To be honest, I only tested it with humans and it worked really well. Eye autofocus is also very accurate and reliable. It should also work with other subjects such as animals, birds, vehicles, and so on. Overall, the stills autofocus is very solid and definitely good enough for sports or wildlife shooting. The video autofocus is an upgrade over the X-T4, but there is still some work that needs to be done. In most situations, it works completely fine. Speed and accuracy is not an issue in any situation. It also doesn't have issues with backlit subjects and the low light. Importantly, it won't make a pause in the middle of the transition, which is sometimes an issue with the X-T4. The main weakness of this system seems to be the focusing from close distance to infinity. In those situations, it still does that back and forth movement typical for contrast-based systems. I hope that this will be improved by a firmware update, because other than that, I am quite happy with the video autofocus. Another standout feature of the X-H2S is the in-body image stabilization. Fujifilm claims 7 stops of stabilization. Subjectively, it is indeed a little bit better than the 6.5 EV systems that I've tested so far. For stills, I was able to get 1.5 second exposure at 16mm without stabilized lens with no issues at all. In video, it is incredibly effective. Wider shots look like on a tripod. Despite that it is a very powerful stabilization, it still behaves quite naturally. There are no sudden snaps or anything like that. The warping is actually very well controlled. I have tested it at 13mm and it worked really well. There is also an option to use digital image stabilization, which adds 1.1 times crop and it makes the stabilization even more effective. The IBIS can also work with lens stabilization, but unfortunately I wasn't able to test that because all of my lenses are non-OIS. Overall, the in-body image stabilization is definitely a highlight of the X-H2S and one of its biggest strengths. Continuing with the standout features, we have the video specs. The list of resolutions, codecs, and frame rates that the X-H2S can shoot is pages long. It can shoot OpenGate 6.2K video up to 30 frames per second. OpenGate means that it is full sensor 3x2 video. It always shoots 6.2K video in 10-bit, either in H.265 up to 720 megabits per second, or in ProRes up to 2754 megabits per second. The amount of detail captured in 6.2K video is very high as expected. This mode also gives you an option to horizontally reframe the footage, which might be useful. 4K DCI video is available up to 60 frames per second with no crop. You can also combine 4K with quite extreme codecs up to ProRes 422HQ in 1877 megabits per second for 60p. It can also shoot 4K 120p but with 1.29 times crop. That is still very respectable in my opinion. I have shot most of my testing footage in 4K DCI 25p 10-bit 422 in 200 or 360 megabits per second. This is a good compromise between the bitrate and the file sizes. 4K video is fully downsampled, so it looks great, there is plenty of detail, and it is just a very nice APS-C 4K video. With such high bitrates, the X-H2S should provide a very good footage for color grading, which brings us to the F-Log 2. Fujifilm claims that it captures 14 stops of dynamic range. In my experience, it is reasonably easy to work with. Getting the exposure right isn't that difficult if you have some experiences with log. Those high bitrate files contain plenty of information for expanding the gamma curve, so the color grading is also fairly easy. External RAW video is available as well. It is a typical mirrorless camera implementation which utilizes log workflow. It captures a ton of dynamic range, but it is pretty difficult to work with. It is available in 6.2K, but my Ninja V only supports 4.8K. Also worth mentioning is the full-size HDMI port, which is much more convenient to use with external recorders. Fujifilm used to have some issues with the smoothness of automatic exposure changes in video. The smoothness issues are completely fixed. Automatic exposure adjustments may still be a little bit slow in more extreme situations though. Fujifilm also offers a fan accessory which can be installed on the backside of the camera. I haven't had any overheating issues during my usage, but when I tried to make it overheat, the fan did turn on after several minutes of shooting high bitrate video. Low setting is pretty quiet and it might be usable with a directional microphone. High setting is pretty loud. I actually like this approach. I think that it is a better solution than having the fan mounted all the time and not needing it 95% of the time. Overall, the X-H2S is an excellent video camera. It can definitely be used for very serious filmmaking. As I have said, the X-H2S is a purely pragmatic package, so it uses conventional controls with PSAM dial and command dials. That is definitely the right choice for a camera that is meant to perform in the first place. The grip is in my opinion very well shaped, deep enough, and there is sufficient gap between the grip and the lens. I think that most people will be happy with this grip. X-H2S has two command dials, a joystick, D-pad, and a sufficient amount of logically placed buttons. The buttons have a very nice feel to them. Probably the only thing that I miss on a flagship camera such as this one is a dedicated drive mode dial, although there is a well-placed drive button. There is also a status LCD on the top of the camera. It is a more advanced OLED panel that can display all kinds of information. It is quite an important feature for old school users, but I never use status displays to be honest. The battery grip is also available, which is quite important for a camera such as this one. The materials match the camera. The controls are doubled for more comfortable shooting in a vertical position. What I really like is that Fujifilm lets you put two batteries in the grip and keep one battery in the camera, so we can have three batteries installed. All three batteries can be charged through the USB-C port on the camera. One more thing that I have to mention is the strap mounts, which are integrated in the body, so there is no need for those annoying little triangles and you can still use the thicker version of Peak Design anchors. Huge thumbs up for that. The user interface is identical to the X-T4. It is pretty well organized and structured, so once you get a hold of it, it is pretty easy to navigate. Unfortunately, it still can't be controlled using a touchscreen, which is a bit of a shame. The Q menu is in my opinion great. If you set it up properly, you can change the settings very efficiently using the Q menu with touchscreen and dials. It is my preferred way of changing the settings on X-H2S. The display is also carried over from the X-T4. It uses a 3-inch 1.62mm dot panel. This is a very good panel, sharp, color accurate, and bright enough for outdoors use. It is a 3x2 display, which is better than 4x3. It is a rotating screen, which I still don't really like, but that optional fan which requires a rotating mechanism is a sufficient justification even for me. The viewfinder uses 5.76mm dot panel with 0.80x magnification. This is a great panel. It is very detailed and bright. The magnification is a little bit too much for me personally. I would prefer 0.76x, but it is not a big deal. X-H2S uses the same NPW325 battery with 2020 mAh capacity that we already know from the X-T4. The CPA rating should be 720 shots in economy mode and 580 shots in normal mode, which is a very good value. You should also be able to get 90 minutes of 6.2K video. If you need more battery life, you can add 2 more batteries in the grip as I have mentioned. To sum up, first of all, I'm really happy that the X-H2S exists. Stacked Sensor has made it possible to put together a relevant APS-C camera. The highlights of the X-H2S are the shooting speed, video specifications, and in-body image stabilization. It is outstanding in these three aspects. 40 frames per second, 6.2K raw video, and 7-stop in-body image stabilization should make the target audience very happy. The sensor output in terms of the low light and the dynamic range is very solid for APS-C, but there isn't really any improvement over the X-Trans 4. Importantly, the autofocus can match the shooting speed. The X-H2S offers all of that in a very well made and compact package. Other aspects such as the handling, display, electronic viewfinder and the battery life won't let it down either. Fujifilm still needs to work on the video autofocus and the main menu could use touch controls. Other than that, I can't really complain about anything. APS-C flagships are back. This is the right way to compete with a full frame. So that's it for this video, thank you for watching, I hope that you liked this video and that you have found it to be useful. Stay tuned for more videos and maybe consider subscribing if you don't want to miss my future content. I appreciate your feedback in form of thumbs up or thumbs down. If you would like to ask anything or share your opinion, please do so in the comment section and see you next time.